I'm not the same person. Can you still love me today?
Right.
If I choose this other path? That's the challenge we have. I feel like sometimes it's unfortunate that we go through a lot of our life in silence, and then we hit a spot at some point of our life where we realize we missed a lot of years in silence and in pain, and we just navigated life. What makes you now want to really talk about it? Like, what was it in your life that you feel like, wow, I've been sitting in this pain alone. I've been in silence. What do you feel like was that push towards it's time?
I think, honestly, through some of my therapies, we resist a lot because it's so much easier to suppress those feelings. It just becomes easier to live your life. So for me, through therapy, I finally realized that I felt a tremendous relief to finally be able to get some of that off, tell some of those stories in secret behind closed doors. And then over time, just realizing that I desperately have felt silenced for so long because I trained and work in the medical profession for so many years. And there's a sense of security and privacy that goes with that.
Do you feel like that was part of keeping you in silence by being in that medical?
Absolutely. But when I would go behind those closed doors, I didn't want anybody to know my story for that reason, because it was my safe place where I could be myself. And I didn't want anybody to feel the pain that I felt. But on the other hand, I also had to see patients all day. And in a health and wellness environment, it's your job to teach young children how to grow and to become young adults that can make good, solid decisions. And abuse was not a part of that theme at all.
Yeah. Did you ever go to therapy earlier in life, or was therapy always later in life?
Therapy was always later in life, because for me, after I escaped the abuse, it took 15 years for my body to kind of go through what I would call a mental and physical breakdown. I honestly thought I just had physical fatigue from work because I still hadn't acknowledged it. It was finding a safe place with a safe person in my life that was the only friend that I had that was willing to say, hey, those stories that you're talking about, that's abuse. Yeah. That was honestly the first time in my life that I thought that I could actually explore that feeling. I was too afraid to talk about it. I ended up going to see a functional medicine doctor. Most people don't understand that your gut is frozen for years. And a lot of us end up with immense medical conditions, and then the depression and anxiety that goes along with the PTSD that you get once you become a victim of abuse. Getting a hold of the physical components and helping my body become physically stronger initially helped me. It gave me the desire and the power to want to feel much better mentally. We don't have to normalize the behaviors that were normalized when we grew up. We don't have to accept that. And you can say no.
What was that moment where you're like, hey, I have not dealt with this? You said, being a PA and in the medical world, that was your safe space. Mm-hmm. So you didn't really talk about it with anyone. You go in and do your job. That was your outlet. Mm-hmm. But then years go on and you have kids and, you're with someone. So you are just kind of doing life, yes. Right? And you took the abuse that happened and you put it over here on the side, right? You thought about the life that was in front of you. Mm-hmm. What was it where you're like, I have to deal with this?
I've been a PA for 25 years. When I started having panic attacks, those shortly led within 3 months to a scenario where I knew I wasn't going to be able to continue doing the work that I did. My brain, I think, was trying to tell myself, I'm just going to take a little time off. And when I went home, I realized I had a huge reflection when I wasn't at work taking care of people every day anymore. I was having a lot of panic attacks, and a lot of it was the severe depression.
Did you put it together that this wasn't just about work at that point?
I probably would say I had 3 to 5 encounters of going to different specialists to try to address the multitude of physical symptoms that I had, trying to talk about some of the things that happened and never really making success. And I think it's because the medical community does not know how to recognize PTSD in a survivor of personal trauma. We often think of PTSD as combat or military trauma because I don't know that I even would have said to anybody, I have PTSD. It took me a long time to realize I was living with PTSD. And once I acknowledged that I truly was a survivor of abuse and that I allowed my brain to say, it's okay. It's okay.
Yeah.
You survived.
The years we spent in silence and not dealing with it affected our other relationships, ourselves. We forget about ourselves for such a long time. It's almost like we're so numb, like just we don't feel anything.
I grew up in the 80s where, unfortunately, a lot of behaviors were normalized for so many years. And I really think it groomed a lot of us to unfortunately become who we became. When I reflect back to my early 20s when I went to college, I had the most confidence when I went to college. That kind of started my journey of dysfunctional relationships again, because it went back to normalizing. When I grew up, dating, there was a lot of infidelity, a lot of cheating, and that was all normalized when we grew up. And so when you become a young adult, you become very confused as to what you are to do when a relationship ends. I was trained to just move on.
It all starts in our childhood. And I think that generation, the dad worked and mom stayed at home. No one was emotionally available. And no one talked about feelings. No one went to counseling.
I grew up on a farm. And so I got on a bus at like 7 a.m., went to school. I played sports. Thankfully, sports and cheerleading honestly kept me out of trouble. I wouldn't get home until 6 or 7 at night. It would be dark. My dad was a farmer, a rancher. So yes, we grew up. Our parents worked very hard. But I think generally speaking, parents were somewhat emotionally unavailable. We didn't talk about things because we didn't grow up communicating difficulties or anything like that. So when it came to problem solving in a relationship, I never had any skills.
Well, I think it was very, again, on our own.
Yes.
Figuring it out in that generation. It was
all experimental.
Do you feel like overall you had a good childhood?
I think the hardest part, once you realize and you understand everything that led you to who you are, you understand everything. So when I reflect back, I think the biggest upset was probably the decision that my parents allowed me to date an older person. When I was 14, I was allowed to date a man that was 18, 19 years old. Unfortunately, I was sexually groomed at that time. And I think that the trajectory of my life changed.
From that moment
forward.
Do you think you just figured that out?
I did, just within the last 3 to 5 years.
Wow. It's interesting what you can go back to kind of have a pivotal moment of like, that is what changed me to go that direction.
Yes. I think if we all reflect and think about the intimate exposures that you have once you become intimate with another person at that young age, the exposures I had were just way advanced. And unfortunately, that led to promiscuous behavior. It led to alcohol. When I reflect back, definitely that changed the trajectory of my life. And because that was my first love. We dated for 3 years, and against my parents' wishes. So I would never want people to think that they were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe her parents let that happen. Yes and no, because people have to realize that back in the 80s, when you left the farm and you went out with your girlfriends or your friends for the night, your parents didn't have any way of reaching you. It was a great system because as long as you hung out with people that didn't tell your story, that you were safe, right?
Yeah.
So growing up in the 80s, it was great when it came to that. Those were definitely some decisions and some life experiences that I wish that never existed.
I know you go off to college and, the abuse that started happening.
So I met my abuser through just a group of friends. And what I would tell anybody is that a true narcissistic can appear to be the most amazing, charming, romantic, incredibly good-looking person. And that's who this person really presented to be. And I would say that within 6 to 8 months of dating, I already saw some red flags that I had kind of ignored. And shortly thereafter, some of the abusive things came out.
So you've already had some toxic, let's call it,
yes,
in your relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then you meet this other guy. You are dating for, you said 6 to 8 months, and you start seeing some of the red flags. What did you do? Just overlook them?
A lot of people asked me this over the years. They would say, "You're so confident, you're so strong, you're such an assertive person. How did an abusive person get a hold of you?" I think people really underestimate the power of a true predator. They are truly powerful. And when I reflect back, I see things along the way that showed me the power that he inflicted on me every day that over time took control, honestly, over my emotions and my everyday behaviors. Everything from when he starting to sell my furniture when I was at work. When I would come home, it was presented as, "Hey, I sold the couch that we have stuck in the back and got some extra money for us." So little things like that along the way that, yes, when I think back, I know that I said to myself, "Oh my gosh, he sold my couch today." And I would have to process that silently because it was presented to me in a fun way, right? But my brain was telling me otherwise. Those were some of the little things along the way.
What was the first sign, like, this is a relationship that doesn't feel good? When you reflect back, that was the first moment that I should have went the other way.
The way he treated his daughter's mother.
And what was that?
Complete disrespect. So the picture was painted to me that his daughter's mother was not a good person. And so for me, I tried deep down to understand and maybe try to understand that he was maybe hurting. I would justify it in my own mind.
You're trying to kind of accommodate this person. So you tiptoe
Yes.
around the conversation. Do you approach him?
Yes. Over time, as I became more comfortable in the relationship, but very quickly in the relationship, I was told where I was allowed to input my opinions and where I was not. He manipulated me exactly where he wanted me to be in that relationship. And we were distanced, meaning I never had any physical contact with the little girl's mother. He kept us apart for a reason.
So you're dating. Do you have your own place?
I had my own place initially, and then he moved me in. It's hard for me to remember everything about the timeline because there's a lot of memory loss that goes with people that have PTSD. When I moved into the house with him, I always thought that we were taking that next step and that I was finally making the progress out of my hard work that I was putting in. When I realized that he was in financial trouble, as soon as I moved into the house, again, he started selling my furniture. And then he very quickly asked for some money, and I wired a large sum of money into his account. And at the time, yes, my brain was telling me all kinds of things. But I was pushing them away fast.
What makes you, because you do have the confidence, right? You ultimately shut down and his voice becomes louder. What happens between you saying, "Hey, the way that you speak to her is disrespectful. I'm uncomfortable.
Yeah.
I love children. This doesn't work." And then he's saying what to you early on?
They have a lot of ways that they fluctuate in how they communicate with you. So there's times when he would be very aggressive, and sometimes that would even be telling me what I can and can't do. And then there's times when they can be very engaging and make you feel very loved. And that's what draws you back into them over and over again.
Was there a point where you knew I should have left and not continued the relationship early on?
I would say yes. I don't know that I have total recollection of everything because of the memory loss. And that's been a huge, huge part for me that I struggle with, because I used to tell people that I lost like 8 years of my life, because that's the total time we spent together.
Somebody just actually asked me a question yesterday and I couldn't answer it. I was like, I don't recall.
Sometimes people will say, tell me some of the good times. Tell me some of just the normal times that you had, so I can understand what it was like to live in that environment, like on a good day. And sometimes it's really hard to even extrapolate just general day-to-day stuff, because there's such a break in your memory that I do have memories, but I have a lot of times when there's just nothing there.
Yeah. So, you became pretty successful. You go to medical school, being a PA, you have money that, you can take care of him, right? And you obviously move in. You're seeing these moments where this isn't a good relationship.
Really what I think it is, I spent a lot of time looking for my knight in shining armor.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us girls are looking for that one person, right? That one person that's going to be the everything.
Yeah.
The protector, the one that we fall in love with, that takes care of us, that takes care of our emotions. But I realized that I came from an emotionally neglected environment, and my father was not emotionally available to me because he came from an abandoned life himself. I feel like I'm searching out for what I never had when I was a little girl.
You're seeing red flags though, so that's your chance to go the other way.
Yes. He was so powerful, so charming.
Yeah.
And in the good times, I had the feeling in my heart, I did have feelings that this could be the one. I really did have those feelings when the charm was on. And that's the biggest warning I would give any person in an abusive environment like that, is the power of those people is unbelievable. That it took me 8 years to plan my escape. I did escape. I did survive. I don't think people realize that. I think people a lot of times say, why didn't you just leave? Or why not just let the cops take you one night after 911's been called? The reason why you don't is because of the ultimate fear that that person will circle back. There is an escape that some people do have to plan to actually get out of that.
Well, I can actually speak even from my own sexual experience. I planned an escape when it was happening.
Yeah.
I mean, I did. I saved my money. I got a car. I did the things I knew I needed to have a plan. Like, okay, when I turned 18 and graduate, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Like, I'm picking up my daughter and I'm moving. But I was planning that for years. There's moments where you're like, okay, I want out, but you're not ready.
Yeah.
And you just can't yet. 8 years is a really long time. So at what point does it become more than disrespect and it starts going down the abuse route?
So there probably became a 3 to 4 year time frame that I developed coping skills, which became alcohol after work, to cope with the life outside of work, inside that home.
Was there a season of just like emotional abuse?
That would be hard for me. That's that block. Within the first 2 years, there would have been something physical. I would say, now that I can reflect back, a lot of our nights were dinners out. And that became, for me, the time that I was trying to decompress from work. So I would have a glass or two of wine. And then that became the time that I would probably say what I really felt about the life that I was living with him. And then that would escalate into physical retaliation, I guess is what I would
by
call it.
Expressing how you were feeling.
Yes, by expressing how I was feeling for living with somebody like that.
Yeah.
So I think that my alcohol consumption allowed me to be brave enough to say how I really felt. And then the physical retaliation back at me as a result of that is how the physical stuff started.
Do you remember like the first time you express yourself to tell him that this is not okay? Was that not enough for you in that moment to say, like something's wrong. Because my abuse stopped. There's like a year where he stopped, touched me. And then there's like a 1 year where he stopped touching me, but then it became control. So it went to a different form of abuse. And then it goes back to sexual.
I think the cycle that I noticed was with what I call emotional abuse, to have somebody control and take power over you. So again, I wasn't really allowed to have friends. I didn't have social media. So he controlled every aspect of my life and pretty much alienated me from my family and my friends, so that he could control the things that I was exposed to and the things that I was not exposed to. And they will circle back and make sure that you understand how much power they have over you. Some people might say, well, why didn't you just get up the next day and gather your stuff and leave? Like, you can just leave, like, just go. You don't have children or anything, just go. The weakness that you have following those events is unreal. They strip you of every bit of emotional power that you have, so that even if you thought the next day, I'm going to leave, I'm not going to take this anymore, you didn't have any emotional strength. I tried a few times. I went and I would go look at apartments. I would go put money down on apartments. And then I would call them back before midnight and say, I can't do it. I would make up an excuse like, oh, it's just not the right place. I'm so sorry. And I would beg them to give me my deposit money back because I was too afraid to make that move. And it was more emotionally. I was so afraid to be. You're so lonely when you're abused.
You feel like no one would understand you. Yeah.
It was easier to be with
than to be alone.
It hurt. I was so ashamed.
The guilt.
It's supposed to be the strong one.
That's what we tell ourselves. So you weren't afraid of like the consequences? You were more afraid, do you think, to be alone?
Yes. I wasn't afraid of him because, well, times I had a lot of alcohol because that was the only way I could survive around him.
I think a lot of people might be more afraid of consequences of what this person would do to me if I left. I've never really heard someone ever say what you just said, where you were afraid, you felt you would rather stay in the environment to be with this abuser than to be alone with you.
I was reminded every day that I wasn't going to be able to do anything on my own. You believe it. I suffer with identity crisis a little bit because you do develop somewhat of a different identity based on what they allow you to be or not be. Don't you sometimes think what all the people that knew maybe what was happening to you, why they sat around and watched it?
I had a lot of shame and guilt, and I wanted nobody to know I was abused, like at all. So if somebody came around, they wouldn't have known I was abused because it was so isolated. Yeah. Sometimes they hide it so well, and then us as the victim help them hide it. We're so good at protecting that other person too.
I do recall one incident. I was being abused and friends walked in and stopped it, thankfully. I wanted somebody to beat the shit out of him for once.
Yeah.
They stopped it, but that's all that took place. They were kind enough to call a cab for me. But in those times when you're left alone, that's the last thing you want.
So he abuses you. Was that a regular thing?
I would say the emotional abuse and the power and all of that was definitely a regular thing. That was a daily thing. It got to the point where I despised him, and it became my ultimate plan to develop a plan to become healthy enough and physically and mentally strong enough that I could walk out on my own. And that I knew would have to be my plan. In the end, I realized it was me, the authentic me, that came out that day. And there was no alcohol or drugs on board with either one of us. So it was the most real moment ever. It was the middle of the day, and he was kind of playing his power moves where I had finally said, look, I remember sitting on the couch saying, look, I just, neither one of us are happy. We've tried counseling. It's become very toxic. The therapist has told us that. I'm ready to move on. I'm fine with it now. I'll get my stuff together. I'll move. We'll make it decent. And I'm okay with it now. I'm at peace with it. And he got all upset and was raising his voice. And when I finally said, I think this is the best thing. I've got an apartment, going to get my stuff together, going to plan for some movers. He flipped out and he said no. And he said, I'm going to be the one that calls the shots. And if you think that you're going to move out of here, then I'll just call the movers right now and I'll have them here in an hour. What do you think about that? I said, I think that's a fantastic idea. He was on the phone with the movers.
Yeah.
2 hours, I was out of that house. Like, I think he realized that it played against him.
So what got you to that? Because that's the 8 years that you
Yes.
in it.
You get to a point, honestly, where you do despise that person. I learned more. He's definitely likely a victim of abuse himself.
Yeah.
And you know what I would say? I would say to that person today, I deeply for you.
Yeah.
For the pain that you endured.
Yeah.
But you have no right to hurt me like you hurt. It doesn't work like that.
The hardest thing, my mom who promoted my sexual abuse, I've forgiven her in my early 20s. And I think it's because I put it in perspective of what happened to her that she would allow her own child to be abused.
Yes.
I think about him who abused me. And I think the same thing, what happened in your childhood that you think it's okay to sexually abuse me?
I don't
think happened at some point in your life and you shifted that way.
Yes.
What that is, I don't know.
Yes.
But I guess that's where I can separate it to go, unfortunately, I just happen to be a part of that person's journey. But now it's I get to take my life back. Like you said, 8 years, but this is your time.
Yeah.
If somebody's in it, that's currently in it today. What would you tell them? What would you say to someone to save them? Because here's the thing, when you're in it, it is super hard. I mean, it's easier to be on the other side. I know that.
Yeah.
But also, it's if I would have had more of an outlet, social media, we talk about that now, all these different platforms and outlets. I didn't have any of that. I was very isolated. Let's just, push it aside, let it go, pretend it didn't happen. Right. We're starting to, now talk about, hey, I was sexually abused. Hey, I had lived that. Because again, what's interesting about, I'm sure your lives, people can look at my life and go, she must have had some amazing childhood and career and I've had success, but I lived 6 years of sexual abuse, years of hiding behind a lot of shame, a lot of guilt, feeling dirty. My challenge with my story was I told my mom, who was supposed to be your protector.
Yes.
So I stopped there because she was my mom.
Thankfully, we live in times now where I think it is just going to get better and easier for people to tell their story.
Yeah.
And even if it's just a glimpse, look, I would say 2 things. My medical person would say that when your brain sends your gut a message, your gut sends your brain 8 messages back. So I would definitely tell anybody that if your gut is telling you that something is wrong, it's definitely wrong.
Yeah.
It's 100% wrong. And for me, I think I would also tell anybody, when I reflect back and think about all the times that I always wonder if somebody would have circled back and talked to me and rescued me. I always hoped that maybe one of the officers that came to our house on one of those dreadful nights, that maybe somebody would circle back and find me at work someday in a safe place. And nobody did. I think it's just finding that safe person that you feel safe talking to just open up and share your feelings with. It's that one step that you take towards freedom. I do think that's going to be easier because we were, unfortunately, in the 80s, growing up in the 80s and 90s, you're kind of sworn to silence and secrecy. And because you don't want to feel the shame, you hold on to those secrets.
Just speaking to people, that I have recently, it's how many were told, you're never going to tell anyone. I know that, your, uncle had touched you or had beaten you, but like that is something we are not going to talk about. And then they carry that, which I want to talk about how those impact our relationships,
Yes,
later in life.
absolutely.
I know like with the abuse, there's nights where that's part of your trauma that you're dealing with today, right? Is the nightmares of it.
The sleep is the biggest part. In the very beginning, I was probably only able to sleep maybe for an hour or two at night. I was on all kinds of sleep medications because in the beginning of my healing, I had lots of traumatic nightmares. You always try to rationalize their behavior.
That's the part that is very difficult too, is that I know when I was abused, I instantly blamed myself.
Yeah.
I couldn't comprehend why someone would abuse me.
He would make sure that whatever happened was my fault because he would tell me that.
Yeah.
And that's why, as a victim over time, you just accept that. And over time, you start believing that you are truly deficient of a lot of things. And that's what ultimately leaves you stuck in that environment because they actually render you powerless, but you kind of did it to yourself. It's a brain fuck.
I mean, that's where your identity starts getting lost.
Absolutely. I will tell you my ultimate worst night because I think it helps people just get a feel. I had already moved out. So this is how they lure you back. I had moved out and I had my own apartment. So I'd already escaped the abuse, the relationship. I was trying to move on. And he had talked me into coming over one night. And I did it. I went over to his house. I'm pretty sure I had a drink because I was still drinking. I remember waking up in the middle of the night. So it was not my intention to be over there past just visiting, but I wake up in the middle of the night. I'm tied to his bed and I don't have any clothes on. And when I wake up and realize that it's in the middle of the night and I'm still here, a lot of things went through my mind as to, was something in my drink? How am I still here? I grabbed my stuff very quietly because he was asleep. I got to the front door, and when I unlocked the front door, he comes running out of the bedroom. And I literally unlocked my car and just ran to my car and jumped in my car and tried to start it. He's standing there and he picks up a huge planter out in front of the house and he literally pitched it on the top of the car on my sunroof. And as soon as it hit my car and I hear my sunroof shatter, my car started and I threw it in drive and I propelled myself out of his driveway, drove myself home. I lived about 2 miles. I got inside my house. I got into my bathtub and started pulling the glass out of my hair. And I think that's when it finally hit me that this is not safe. Like, you can't go back, not one more time, because he claims he just wants to talk or he wants to feel better or whatever.
So even after you moved out,
I went back.
I want to talk about that. It's not a one and done thing. I say that for somebody struggling. Like, it wasn't as simple as just doing it. 8 years, you're like, I have the courage. We're sober. We have this conversation. You saying what you need to say and saying, I'm done. That takes so much courage. It took 8 years. You get this voice. You move out. What made you go back once you had been out?
I didn't like myself. When I go back to the young girl, all the way up till my teenage years, I loved myself. I know I did.
Yeah.
I loved life. I had a great passion for life. And it was those teenage years of the sexual experiences, the sexual grooming. He cheated on me a lot. So a lot of that went into that. I never learned at that point. I was never in love with myself at that point. Through that process, I learned that I didn't like myself, right? Yeah. Because I was allowing myself to do things that didn't make me feel good. I was kind of, in so many weird ways, I was taught to do that. It took me a long time to realize that all of these things that I kept finding myself in these patterns was because I never, ever stood back at that one crucial point, I guess, in my life to say, look, it's okay what you went through. You're going to be okay. And I guess I wish that I could have learned to love myself again after I was kind of abused at that young age, because I went forward thinking that my purpose in life was to please everybody else.
My own life experiences, I mean, it is like the identity crisis, because you enter the relationship one version And then you get in the relationship and you start becoming another version. And then you move out. And now who are you? Who do you become? You're trying to just navigate life, which doesn't stop. It continues. So, going from, so you don't want to obviously sit in your apartment being alone. You don't allow time to really sit with self because you're at this point,
correct,
not really loving yourself again. You're super lost. Do you think because when he called you, it was like feeling like somebody wants to be with me?
Yes. It was very painful to be by myself.
Yeah.
My best friend at the time spent my very first night with me in my apartment. And I remember telling her that night, I'm going to move home tomorrow, back to my abuser. I said, no, you're not.
Yeah.
I said, yeah, I am. When you're in that much pain, the physical pain is real. It hurt too bad. And the only time I didn't hurt was when I drank. And then when I drank, bad things happen. You find yourself in a very, very vicious cycle.
You're just not wanting to feel it. Like I would say to someone too, like, don't be hard falling back because you got out, which was such a big deal. And it took you a long time to get there. And if you went back, like, that's why I was asking, like, did you continue to go back?
Wasn't the final night. Once I had moved out, I was still coping a lot, but I was starting to feel like this is going to be okay. I mean, those are just those moments when you're like, gosh, I am alive. I really need to value this.
It's very hard to get to the spot of like finality. Really hard to just take that moment and go, I cannot go back. And really mean it. We need people to recognize that people can be overconfident in abuse situations because we're protecting self and the person abusing us. We need help. It's just we can sell ourselves that we're good.
It's a total self-protection. So there's very few people that know, but of the people who do know, I would say the common theme that I used to get would be, I would never have known when I would come in and see you in the office. And how did you do that? When I would go to work, my team members and all my patients and my families, they were my support systems. When I went behind those closed doors, I was safe. So it allowed me to authentically be myself when I was there. We're always so self-critical of ourselves. So I always hoped that nobody ever saw or felt my pain. I always wanted to make people feel better.
Like, I want to change the generation, right? Where my kids don't have that same experience, and do have a support system and they can be heard. And I'm emotionally available for them, right? So that they feel like they have outlets. If they're ever in those situations, they have team mom, right? Like, that's the beauty of, the next generation, because we are talking about it. What happens so you get out, you're obviously a PA, so you're successful.
Yeah.
You have a relationship and you have kids now.
That honestly all happened very quickly. Had children within like 3 years. Actually met him probably within a month of moving out.
Yeah.
He was very much a part of my healing process. It was definitely on a very dark path.
Yeah.
I can see that now that I look back. It feels good to be honest, honestly.
I think now that I'm older, the authentic and realness and being okay with emotions and feelings and choices.
Yes.
And not worrying about what other people think.
By the time I had escaped from the abuse, I had been here for every bit of 15 years. I had really, for the most part, isolated myself effectively from my family. So by the time I had gotten out of the abuse, I just didn't have any support. And a lot of that was my own doing.
Yeah.
And so for me, I know I was just an absolute hot mess. And I think that I still, despite all the horrible that went into that, it took until after having my children for my brain to truly acknowledge the abuse. And once I acknowledged the abuse, then I was on the path to healing. If you would have had a conversation with me and we were medical and you would have said, well, were you abused? I would have said no. That's how much you deny abuse. You have to. And once your body accepts and believes it, then there's no question. Because the abuser makes sure that you are told every single time that it was your fault. So then it doesn't become a matter of abuse. It becomes a matter of, how do I fix myself? Because I'm a mess. It's me. I'm the problem. That's what they make you believe. I've played the scenario out with myself and said, what would have saved you? Thought, wonder if somebody would have circled back and came to my office one day, a private investigator or somebody that said, hey, you know what? We see all these reports. We know what's happening. Like, we're here for you. We can help you navigate this. Like, let's build a plan. I think I would have said, I don't need to build a plan. There is no plan. Because I had to preserve everything, including my job. I thought I would have lost my job and my license. I really was that afraid of everything.
That it makes sense though, because you're like, I moved on and I didn't ever feel like I needed to really acknowledge that I was being abused.
I would have to answer a million questions. I don't want to do that. It hurts already. It hurts tremendously. How can I do this? Yes.
Yeah.
Even
because there's so much shame with it. Because you think, why was I not strong enough to get out and to speak up?
You built an identity that's different.
Yeah. I think that's why I love being in my 40s. I was driving and I start crying.
Yeah.
And I remember feeling like, why am I crying? And I was like, I don't know if I've been this happy with life at all in my entire life, with just who I was. When I wanted to say yes, I wanted to say yes. I wasn't saying no when I wanted to say yes.
Right.
Versa.
Yes.
I wasn't people pleasing.
Right.
I was having boundaries and I had conviction of my worth and my value. And I was like, wow, in a very short period of time, I saw a full transformation of self and I cried and I was like, I will never go back to the old version of myself. I could feel pure joy through my whole body and I cried from it.
Yeah. For a lot of us who walk around and carry our trauma loads with us, it's a lot. And I think that when we're able to release that, the empowerment that comes from it is just pretty amazing. You know,
well, I think when we can become
our true authentic self, we don't have to hide anymore. Yeah.
That's the key, because I think if you have to be somebody or not, that again just goes back to avoiding, suppressing, denial. If you could just be free and be yourself and say what you need to say, you know, that we think, well, what would people think of us by the decisions we chose to make? And I think letting go of what people think of us, like really letting go.
It really only matters what you think.
You're embracing the therapy.
I think it's super important. I remember my therapist said, we're going to kind of track back and go back to your childhood. And I remember thinking at first, oh no, I'm fine. I had a great childhood. Yeah. Until I really stopped to think about, I did all the way up until I was 14. And then when I finally stopped and said, no, wait, no, I didn't have a great childhood.
Yeah.
And I think that it's so important to go back and really find out some of those maybe initial experiences that maybe you went through. It just helps piece together the puzzle so that you can really embrace everything, most importantly with yourself.
Well, I think it makes you accept who you are.
Yes.
I would use that as acceptance.
Yes.
Just how you're describing it. Yes. It's like, okay, I took this direction. It's hard to put that all together. If you're just looking at this, it's like we want a full acceptance. How did I even get from here to here?
Yes.
And the only way to understand that is to go all the way back.
Yes.
To find what ultimately shaped you.
Yeah. Kind of like the triggering event.
Yeah.
Really, if you think about it, I think that if a person will go back and explore that, even if it's painful at the time, it will really release that and allow you to move forward. That was probably the breaking point that allowed me to move forward, was acknowledging and accepting that. I think a lot of us would say, man, I never thought I would be the one that said I was abused for 8 years. I never thought that was going to be my dream. If you really go back and think about the things that happened to you in your life, you really can go back and piece the puzzle together. And I think that helps. because it helps us accept those things that maybe definitely weren't on our wish list, right? But it doesn't mean that it has to be our destiny for life. But it does help us process that so we can move forward.
Well, and I think it released from a lot of guilt.
Yes.
Right? Like I had a lot of guilt of like maybe why my divorce failed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like and how I showed up.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yes.
how did I contribute to that relationship?
Yes.
And I think when you can go back not just to that small window and you can go, wow, well, I know how to love really well, but what I don't know how to do is let someone love me. The only way to really understand that was to go back. I wouldn't have pieced that together because to me all of that looked good.
Yes, for me too. Maybe we become hyper-focused on certain things that we feel like primarily shaped us. I think I have the most peace being able to put it all together and to really understand it, because I think for the longest time, maybe during the grieving phases when maybe I was holding more of the victim card, it was not understanding how I could find myself in that position. Because I honestly would reflect back many times in my initial phases and say, gosh, I feel like I grew up and had a great childhood, and I would go back and piece some of it together and say, gosh, I still don't know why this happened to me. But when I really dove into therapy and went back and really talked through a lot of those things early on in my life, I do realize that. And I would urge anybody to explore that, because it helped release me into my freedom phase, which I'm finally in. I feel like I no longer have to hold myself hostage and punish myself for all those decisions.
I think forgiving ourselves
Yes.
for our choices, forgiveness to me is the freedom. And once you accept why that all turned out,
Yes.
and then you can go, I'm going to forgive myself for all those choices. And it was okay that I did all those things.
Yes, which has led me to have the ability to talk about it too.
Yeah.
Because before, I think that's what holds you back too.
You have to let go at some point. I mean, because you could carry that forever.
Yes.
But then you're not going to really live a real fulfilled life because you're carrying the anger and the resentment. How do you now take that information and apply it to your current life? How do you navigate that of kind of an awareness, found identity? How do you navigate that forward? You have obviously a relationship and you're evolving into a new version, maybe one that you've never had because you've been carrying this abuse.
I ended up taking about 5 years total off work to heal to a point where I could, I always knew that I wanted to go back to work. And I am blessed now, I feel like, to work in an environment where I help patients every day with PTSD. I think that it's honestly the very beginning of me evolving. And so it's a balance of deciding to move forward in your life without fear. There were multiple things that factored into the physical part, letting go of alcohol. You have to let everything go and then supplement your body with good supplements, getting my gut health back, changing my diet up. Letting alcohol go was probably the biggest favor I could have done for my body and my brain. Alcohol was was the way for me to numb my pain. But over time, I felt like in my early years, I was the fun drunk. But over time, when trauma set in on my body, alcohol became very toxic for my brain, and it became very confusing for me because it was my only coping. And then I would go to a very dark place, and then I would try to recover from it, and I would become suicidal at times, and I wouldn't understand that. And once I let alcohol go, I really realized that, that was the best thing for me.
Do you feel like, with the suicide thoughts, was that after you recognized and accepted that you had been abused?
Yes.
And now you're like going down a deep depression and trying to cope through alcohol and having suicidal thoughts. I was curious because you said there was a time where you don't really accept the abuse, but then you go dark when you accept the abuse.
When I accepted my abuse, it was unfortunately right around the time of COVID when everything kind of went quiet. Mental health definitely went quiet. I made the choice to just grieve at home, but I didn't access any therapy because it was hard to get therapy during that time frame. I went through some stabilizing treatments with ketamine. I would want to sleep a lot. when I would sleep and then I would wake up, my body just wouldn't want to be alive. My body would physically hurt. I would be nauseous a lot. I would have severe depression. And then I would say things like, the only time I feel good is when I'm asleep. Like, that's the only time that I don't feel ultimately the pressures of anything. Like, that's the only time that I'm peaceful.
Yeah.
So there would be times when I would be like, is that the answer?
Yeah.
Like, sometimes you ask. I mean, I had 2 children at the time. It was never going to be the ultimate answer for me, but I would definitely say those thoughts creeped in, because when you hurt, you just want peace.
You know, because this is going to be new for you, or has started to be new. Like, what are some of the things that you struggle with?
I think in real time, I love that I have my work back, because work has given me the most power within myself. So I think I look forward to most just having some time to maybe just navigate this freely. I don't think there has to be a written script. I'm excited to live mine out in real time for the first time in my life, and just teach my children just how to be good people. I always had that pressure to find Mr. Right and who's going to be your knight in shining armor.
Yeah.
I just want to be me.
We live in what it should look like.
Yeah.
Versus what we want to do internally.
Right.
And then we feel so afraid of what people will think of us, and we don't speak up, and we go further away from ourselves because we can't sit across from each other and have real conversations. Instead, we create avoidance. We avoid conflict, and we lose self over it and navigating what society thinks we should do. We care so much about what other people think that we forget about what we want, what we need, and we walk on tiptoes. Everyone fears abandonment, wants to be liked. They want to be loved. And we feel, a lot of us, because we don't have good, healthy environments, that I could have a real conversation and you're not going to leave me.
Yes.
You're going to understand that I've just grown into this person.
Yeah.
And you're going to love me for who I am today. I'm not the same person. Yeah. Can you still love me today?
Right.
If I choose this other path?
Right.
That's the challenge we have.
Yes.
How do we navigate life with being ourselves?
I think that when you get to this part in life, I'm just excited to just love me and be me. There's a lot of people out there. Domestic violence is unfortunately just a hot topic, but I don't think that there's one woman or man that stays because they want to stay in a relationship like that. And for people to judge people who stay is so hard. I can see the judgment, but it's just because they don't understand why people stay. And so I think it's just being able to be open about your feelings and how you feel and facing them. Because a lot of us are stuck as victims because we're just too afraid to face the fear ourselves, much less the judgment from others. I can finally say that I know that my own self-criticism and judgment is enough, that I really don't care anymore what other people think, because I did make some poor choices. I did. And I wouldn't be the person that would ever put 100% blame even on my abuser, because it didn't start out that way. I would never be that person that paints that one-sided picture. I think once you can move past that, you can embrace it entirely differently and feel like you can let it go.
I would say the most freeing thing is you can love and accept who you are, no matter who's with you. Should be super proud from an outsider looking in.
I finally feel that. So thank you. I really genuinely appreciate that, because as you well know, there's a lot of work that goes into that.
Oh, yeah.
To the point where you can actually genuinely smile again in life. And thank you, because this gives me, as a medical provider, this was the only safe place for me to share my story.
What would you tell Holly if she was in her 20s and she had to do her life all over again?
I would remind myself why I love myself. I think we forget and we get lost as to why we love ourselves. And I would remind myself the unique, endearing qualities about me to help that person have such an amazing life, change the trajectory of their life, honestly. I would tell that person, love you, do it for you, be you.
Is that what you're telling her today?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just listening to your story is really never lose yourself for someone else. Ever. I don't care how much they love you. If it's changing who you are at your core, that should be enough to go the other direction. You're too lovable. Don't let anyone take it away.